The next session addresses regional economic growth in the zone, the promise of regional trade architecture. The session will focus how regional trade architecture could be developed to allow a free and competitive market in the broader Asian region. This session is moderated by Mr. Gordon Flake, who is the CEO of the Perth US-Asia Centre, as we all know, who himself is an expert on US-Asia relations. So, Gordon.
Well, thank you, Aiko, and thank you all for sticking through the end of the program. I think we have been richly fed today. We've had tremendous panels on strategy, looking over the horizon, on security issues, business perspectives, on kind of day-to-day security issues. And so this is our chance to really focus on the trade, investment, the business side of it in terms of regulation and structure and the way trade and investment in the region are organized. In many respects, the original concept of in the zone was driven, of course, by economic drivers, driven by the trade flows out of Australia up into the region. And so it's befitting that we wrap up this forum by focusing on trade and economic issues. We are fortunate in that the issues we're discussing today couldn't be more topical. The Prime Minister kindly arranged just a few weeks before this forum to have a very successful trip in Northeast Asia, concluding free trade agreements with Japan, with South Korea, a new focus on a free trade agreement with China. On top of that, President Obama again kindly arranged his schedule to make sure that he came through the region focusing on the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade negotiations. And so it's really set up a wonderful context for us to talk about trade in the region. I would draw your attention once again to the wonderful materials that Elena Douglas put together and prepared. On page 14, you have the veritable alphabet soup of economic and security-related organizations in the region. And I think it is illustrative of the importance of kind of working together as a region, but also of the challenges of how we organize it in the region writ large. We are extremely fortunate today to have a diverse and highly qualified panel of experts to help us think through these issues. And I'm pleased to say that they come from all regions of the zone. From the top of the zone, we have Professor Yang Xiyu, who's at the China Institute for International Studies, but he's also the Executive Vice President of the Institute of Boao Forum for Asia. I think you're all familiar with the new Boao Forum that's been quite dynamic in China recently. In addition to his work here today, he has long experience in the Chinese Foreign Ministry. He's actually had direct negotiating experience with the North Koreans, and so compared to North Korea, the TPP should be easy in that regard. Next to Yang Xiyu, we have Xie Qian Peng, who's the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament in Singapore. In addition to be Deputy Speaker, he's also the CEO of NTUC FairPrice, a corporation. So he brings both a political perspective and a business perspective from Singapore, which in many respects is the heart of ASEAN. And since most of the alphabet soup on page 14 tends to be built off an ASEAN infrastructure, I think we're very fortunate to have him here today sharing his perspectives. And last but certainly not least, on my far left, we have Bruce Gosper, the CEO of Austrade, the government agency in Australia that's primarily responsible for promoting trade and investment, tourism, et cetera, in the region. He also has a long and highly distinguished career in the Australian diplomatic corps. Previously was ambassador to the WTO, and I think we couldn't ask for somebody better to help us think through these issues. I would like to start off in asking individual questions to each of the panelists to kind of kick off our conversation, and I'll work in reverse order, starting off with Ambassador Gosper, asking him to help us understand Australia's strategy for organizing trade and investment in the region. In many respects, the WTO that he was ambassador to previously, the global trade liberalization negotiations, the Doha round, et cetera, are considered to be dead, right? Not going forward. And so there's been a move towards multilateral, minilateral, and bilateral, and we have evidence of all of them in Australia recently. And so I'd like you to give us kind of a view of Australia's position and strategy on how that is organized and promoted in the region.
Sure. Thanks very much, Gordon. A lot of people, and I think this lies behind your question, sort of talk about the balance between multilateral and regional and bilateral efforts in trade policy, and that's certainly a question that's there if you look at what's going on. Both the number of bilateral agreements, and then of course these big mega regional agreements, not just in this part of the world of course, but prospectively at least one between the US and the EU, which is highly significant itself. And plenty of other negotiations as well. I mean, there's even some flickers of life in the WTO in the Doha round negotiations, judging from the outcome of Bali last year. So why are we getting all this activity? And obviously, if you look at the sort of agreements that you're focusing on at the moment, there are some significant trade barriers that we face in some of these markets, and those markets presumably have interests in our market as well. It seems to be that we can do it more effectively sometimes in these sort of bilateral or even these regional agreements. So I guess the real question is, why is that? Well, if you put a rock in a stream, the water will find its way around the rock. When we started the Doha round in 2001, well actually we started it in 1996, we started it with a very comprehensive agenda that covered a lot of tariff issues, agriculture issues, a whole lot of rules issues and the like. And something else happened when we launched the round in Qatar in 2001. China joined the agreement. It acceded to the WTO. So then fast forward to 2008, the last time I was involved in the significant effort to get conclusion to the Doha round, just a mere 7 years later. And two things were obvious. If you're actually writing an agenda for a trade negotiation in 2008, it wouldn't be the same one that you wrote in 2001. It would be quite different. And it would deal with a different set of issues of the sort that bilateral and regional agreements have proved more adept, more agile in actually addressing. And the second thing is that the two key players in the room, not the only players of significance, but the two key players in the room would be the US and China. But China didn't write the agenda. China didn't agree the mandate in 2001. They were just coming into the organisation. So, as I said, if you put a rock in a stream, the water will find a way around it. And what we've tended to find is, because the mandate, the agenda that we agreed in Doha, was not attuned to the modern economy and not attuned to the changed geopolitical circumstances, people have gone on to do negotiations in different ways. So the course of the stream has been affected. As you'd expect, it's sort of run on a parallel but slightly different channel. Maybe it'll converge again at some later point, and that's a significant question, of course, but not thus far. And so what we're seeing is that water is running in a way to reflect what business wants. And it's not a negotiation which is captive to agriculture, as important as an Australian would say that is, but it's around issues like intellectual property, competition, investment, regulatory standards, all those sorts of things that matter. And they matter because it's a much more connected world with many more significant regional and global value chains than we realised in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So there we are. That's the sort of environment we're dealing with. And we respond to that, which means we're reasonably opportunistic. We're looking to move trade negotiations forward wherever the water is flowing most freely and addresses the issues of most significance to our business sector, but always in mind that we're dealing with the same stream. And if we can find ways of convergence or harmonisation with broader global systems, the sooner the better.
If I can follow up specifically on your analogy of it being the stream. I mean, a lot of people, I think, in more polemic settings would say that, you know, the failure of the WTO kind of dammed up a lot of it behind it. So it may be flowing, but it's not the same volume or scope of water. The TPP right now seems to be, you know, the game in town. Something that the United States came lately to, but which at this point has become symbolic in many ways is the third leg of, or the economic leg of the rebalancing towards Asia, something that the President has put a lot of effort into. Should the TPP fail, and again, I'm aware that Tanaka Hitoshi earlier today said it will not fail because it's too important. Should it fail, where does the water flow? What is there a plan B? Are there other initiatives other than the TPP out there, or is it really the only show in town?
Yeah, I don't know that it will fail. There's too many significant players involved in it now, and it's a bit like the Doha round. It might be a dead body that's manacled to your wrist, but you never declare it dead. You prop it up, you try and keep it, and then there's a whole lot of analogies about harvesting and all that sort of stuff. It's awful. But look, the water will find a way, and in fact, there's no shortage of trade negotiations at the moment. People think that trades become, that the negotiations aren't happening at all. But in fact, look at all the plurilateral negotiations that are underway now on services, 2/3 of the world economy, on environmental goods, on the ITA Mark III. You look at the EU-US agreement, RCEP, the TPP, the Pacific Alliance, what's happening in the Gulf, finding its appetite for trade liberalisation again, all the other bilateral agreements that are in play, even the EU-Mercosur agreement showing some signs of life. There's no shortage of trade negotiations. The point is, of course, that all of these negotiations are difficult because the ones that are truly grappling with the issues of the new economy are dealing with some complex things that are much more significant or difficult than tariffs or quota issues. They're dealing with issues at, behind and beyond the border. They're dealing with issues of regulatory convergence and the like. They involve multiple sets of actors in any economy, quite complex issues. So they're hard work and none of them will be easily resolved. So I don't think the TPP, personally I don't see it easily coming to conclusion this year. It might take a bit longer than that, and maybe it'll take quite a bit longer than that. I don't know, and I certainly don't hope so. But we'll find a way at some point.
Thank you. If we can turn to you, Kian Peng, the ASEAN way has both its supporters and detractors. When it comes to negotiations and structures, it's often associated with kind of slow, gradual process and a consensus-based approach. And that's obviously true in trade issues as well. If you remember in our first panel this morning, the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, focused heavily on something that she thought wasn't given enough attention, which is the long-standing Australian Free Trade Agreement with ASEAN. You also had the comments by Ambassador Dino Padi Jalal, where he was talking about upcoming internal events within ASEAN in terms of a much more open free trade agreement within ASEAN itself in coming years. From your perspective, I realize you can't speak for ASEAN, but as again, in Singapore as a nation that is in many respects the heart of ASEAN, I'm curious to your view about ASEAN's kind of role in this broader regional trend, their relationship with Australia in particular, in that regard, in the views that you might share with us.
Well, first of all, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, good. First of all, I think Australia will always have a special place in ASEAN. Why so? Well, first of all, Australia was the first dialogue partner for ASEAN 40 years ago. And it remains I think it's strategically important to ASEAN because of the regional security and economic development. ASEAN indeed is quite, because it's a grouping of countries and people which have very different cultures. The diversity is also there, and therefore the way we have worked ASEAN as a whole has always been one of consensus building. But having said that, the various agreements that have been signed over the years, in particular, I think the one that comes up very strongly and which I would say stands out well and speaks well of ASEAN is the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA. I think that is one which is, compared to most other FTAs, one which can be described as a fairly high standard agreement, and the results also show in terms of the amount of trade that has taken place since it was established in 2010, I believe. 4 years later, I think the amount of trade flows have grown significantly. At the same time, I think the Australian involvement in terms of FDI into ASEAN as a whole has also grown quite significantly. Earlier this morning, we heard from Dino that a lot of talk about Asia, which is clearly a big market, China and the others, but don't forget about ASEAN, because ASEAN represents 600 million market. ASEAN is also a lot closer to Australia than anywhere else. So I think from a trade point of view and from a economic development point of view, Australia is very important to ASEAN. And I think ASEAN as a whole treasures that. ASEAN as a whole also offers a lot of opportunities for more involvement, even more involvement. The many bilateral and regional forums that have been established in the last few years, I think is important because it builds to greater understanding. And from there, the trade flows between countries within ASEAN and Australia, I think is one which is deepening. But I think we need to, besides broadening it, we need to deepen this engagement. This morning, Foreign Minister Bishop talked about the new Colombo plan. I just want to go back a little bit into the people part of it. I feel that beyond trade, as the bulk of today has been talking about trade, but I think not enough attention is focused on the people-to-people relationship. Why do I say that? I think that is important because trade between countries should not be viewed purely as a kind of a transactional basis. Yes, it is, but that's in the short term, we can all work on that basis. But if it is viewed purely in that dimension, I think it will not be sustainable. We have started to see that in almost all countries, the middle income is burgeoning, the market is growing. And you see a lot of challenges that each country, including Singapore, is facing. And if these local issues are not looked into, I think there is a possibility that in every country, everyone starts to look inward. And as we want to do more trade, I think because we're all looking inward, certain forms of protectionism may start to creep in. We've seen this not just in this part of the world, I think even in Europe. I was just sharing with Bruce. Even in Switzerland, you see that there's this slight shift towards being more inward-looking than global. So I see this as danger signs, but as I started from the onset, I think the relationship between ASEAN and Australia, and for that matter New Zealand, is very strong. I see lots of opportunities there. I think we can work at some of the FTAs that have been already established, but I think we need to do even more on other aspects beyond other aspects of diplomacy, to the people, to the culture, to the sports, to education. I think only through that we can ensure openness of the flows remain open, and we can grow on a win-win basis.
On the surface, people-to-people exchanges and free trade agreements may seem to be very different things, but just as Bruce was mentioning at the outset of his remarks, the type of free trade agreements we negotiated in 2001 are very different from those we negotiated in 2008. If you look at those in 2014 and beyond, or even TPP themselves, they ultimately end up having a lot more attached to them. So things that, a decade ago, whether the labor standards or the intellectual property rights or environmental standards aren't there. But also, one of the things that I think probably doesn't get enough attention, if you look at the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement or a lot of what's happening within the Trans-Pacific Partnership right now, is precisely about how do you facilitate quicker and easier movement of people, individuals, that type of people-to-people exchange and relationships. So thank you very much for highlighting that focus. If I could turn a question now to Yang Shiyu. we had a very interesting panel about security issues, which ultimately turned into a US-China panel, right? That was the bulk of the conversation there. And like many issues, the discussion of how trade in the Asia-Pacific is organized in some circles turns into a US-China question as well. And that's certainly true when it came to the US involvement in an active promotion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And in some circles, the TPP was considered to be, a competition with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which was ASEAN-based. I'm curious from a Chinese perspective, which at present is not an active negotiator in the TPP, how you view these competing models and, again, the broader question of trade liberalization in the region.
Well, just like you know, China support and seek for multipolar in the global politics because of the diversities of the world. By the same token, China seek for the multipolar of the trading architecture across the Pacific because of the diversities of the economies. And ironically, China is open to TPP. Meanwhile, US take a very blunt, exclusive position against China. And just earlier this month, Premier of China, Li Keqiang, made an open statement by saying China was open to TPP, indirectly saying although the United States closed the door to TPP. We don't care about exclusion by the United States because China is confident that without China's involvement and participation, any kind of region-wide trading arrangement would be meaningless. For example, China's economy occupies 45% of the East Asian economy. And in terms of TPP, both the largest economies, US and Japan, have been the largest trading partners. So it would be ridiculous to exclude China in the TPP while US and Japan are pushing hard towards a completion of TPP. And last year, China-Japan trading volume has reached the 20% of the Japanese total foreign trade. So how about Japan, US, Japan, European trade? Say, Japan, US is about 7%, and Japan, Europeans about 13.5. So what does it mean? That means Japan-China trade is almost equal with the Japan-US, Japan-European trade in total. So even for Japanese, it's unthinkable that by pushing forward the TPP without cooperating and continue the trade relationship with China, that occupies 20% of the Japanese total trade. So we are confident sooner or later, TPP will certainly open to China. But meanwhile, we cannot wait. China is now seeking for RCEP. That means 10 plus 6 also. 10 means ASEAN country. And the basic idea is 10 plus 1 individual, 3 10 plus 1. Say ASEAN, China, ASEAN, Korea, ASEAN, Japan. The 3 individual 10 plus 1s. And then we can upgrade to 10 plus 3. And although the current extremely difficult political relations between China and Japan, South Korea, Japan, and China trilateral FTA has been resumed. And hopefully by end of this year, we could achieve some progresses. And gradually, when we set up a Northeast Asia free trade arrangement among the 3 big economies that are represented by 20% of the global economy, then we will be able to combine the trilateral free with the 10 ASEAN free market. So that will be great future for everyone. And based on such a process, we will put for the expansion of the 10 plus 3 into the RCEP. So if we compare the DPP and RCEP process, we will find a different way of thinking or different manners between the two free trade process. We understand Americans' way of thinking, say, cut to the point. So Americans are trying to set up the so-called high standard free trade agreement. That's fine. That would be better if we can reach that high standard agreement overnight. That would be great for everyone. But as I said, this region is so diversified that we cannot reach any kind of a high standard agreement in the short term. So I believe China represents another way of thinking, say, go through a gradual way, step by step. So that is the competition between the different manners based on the different cultural tradition. In my understanding, American cultural tradition is cut to the point is one of your characteristics. But for China, Chinese ancient cultural tradition is from the surface to the core, while you seek for go to the core first and go to the outside. So totally different way of thinking based on the culture and represent the current free trade processes. But I think RCEP process will take achievements slowly, but in a sustainable way.
My presumption is that U.S. trade officials, and I'm here in a Perth perspective, not a U.S. perspective, would probably dispute the characterization that China has had the doors closed on it. I think it's probably more of a question of standards and readiness, but I'd welcome Bruce's comments on that as well in terms of the process. From you, however, I wonder if you see the two approaches as mutually exclusive. In other words, is it TPP or RCEP, or is it TPP and RCEP? Do you see them working side by side?
Well, China's position is very clear. We hate to see the competition between RCEP and the TPP because many of the countries like Australia will be both of the circles. So basically, as I said, multipolar means all the arrangements should be in the relationship, should set up the complementary relationship. And we are seeking for gradual way, not because China is close. To my observation, from Xi Jinping era, China has entered a bolder open period. Many Chinese call it as the second round of reform waves after Deng Xiaoping. For example, now China and the United States has conducted a negotiation for BIT, bilateral trade investment, for many years. And only when Xi Jinping takes to office, he determinedly removed the two fundamental obstacles. One is the negative list management. The other is national treatment before admission. Before Xi Jinping era, Chinese negotiators were always reluctant and quite resistant to the two fundamental items because it is really sensitive and and risky for Chinese economy. But that is the cost, that is the price for China's further opening. So now China changed the attitude, and we are working hard and positively on the two items, and that will make the BIT with the United States in substantive progresses. And China has also an ambitious plan of BIT with EU, and acceleration of FTA with Australia and others. So I think it is China is more open, but we are concerned about the other developing economies in this region. They haven't reached such a level that can guarantee the economies' confidence on free trade and investment. So we have to be patient for a gradual manner of free trade investment.